Hi everyone, my name's Aiden Thornton, and it's my great pleasure to provide you with a brief summary of my latest white paper entitled Leading in Complexity 2024, an Initial Inquiry in Tasmania. And I also want to express my thanks to Tasmanian leaders who commissioned this work and made this initial inquiry possible. I just want to start by saying a few words by way of introduction in case we haven't had the opportunity to meet. I am an academic at the Australian National University and a co-lead of the Australian National University Complexity Leadership Lab. I'm a management consultant, a psychometrics entrepreneur, and a street epistemologist. I might just say a few words about each one of those roles. So as an academic at the Australian National University, I hold an interdisciplinary PhD in leadership, complexity, and cognition, and I currently serve as the inaugural Menzies Senior Research Fellow in Leadership and Complexity. I co-lead the Complexity Leadership Lab, and our work spans the theory, measurement, research, education, and practice of complexity leadership. As a management consultant, I have over 25 years of international experience across Australia, Asia, and Europe, working with top-tier consulting firms and blue-chip organizations. As an entrepreneur, I'm currently establishing a psychometrics company that offers an innovative suite of instruments that measure different aspects of leadership. And last, but definitely not least, as a street epistemologist, I'm deeply engaged in creating conditions in which diverse social groups can participate in discussions about controversial socio-political issues. So let me start by giving you an overview of some research that I conducted on the complexity gap. That gave us the opportunity to compare role complexity with cognitive complexity at multiple organizational layers. This is a study that I conducted on just under 700 leaders. And as you'll see from the horizontal axis, we looked at leaders at 4 different organizational layers, from middle leaders to upper leaders to senior leaders and executive leaders. And you'll see on the vertical axis, we were looking at the amounts of complexity that those leaders could contend with, from advanced linear thinking to early systems thinking, advanced systems thinking, and early principles thinking. You'll see in the brown colored bands here, this reflects the role complexity range required at these 4 organizational layers. Less complexity for more junior organizational layers and more complexity for more senior organizational layers. The black box plots represent the actual cognitive complexity of leaders. You'll see from this box plot that there was a fairly decent fit between the cognitive complexity and role complexity for middle leaders, and approximately 12% of middle leaders fell below the lower boundary of role complexity for their role complexity range. For upper leaders, there was also a fairly decent fit between cognitive complexity and role complexity, and approximately 13% of upper leaders fell below the role complexity range. For senior leaders, we can see that the fit is not necessarily so clear. And in this case, 42% of senior leaders fell below the role complexity range. And yes, you guessed it, for executive leaders, the fit seemed to be even more challenging, with approximately 78% of executive leaders falling below the role complexity range. Now, if you'd like to take a look at the specific research methods that I used, the particular measurement instruments that I used, and the particular kind of complexity we used in this study, then please refer to some of my earlier research from 2023 that provides all of these details and also the relevant citations. In general, though, what this does suggest that at least some leaders, particularly leaders at more senior organizational layers, seem to be having a difficult time dealing with complexity. So what exactly do we mean by complexity? Well, in fact, there are actually dozens of different types of complexity that we see in complex systems. Each type of complexity is defined differently, they're measured differently, and in fact, some types of complexity are particularly difficult to measure. We actually don't know which types of complexity are most strongly related to leadership. But I wanted to offer you 2 definitions, 2 working definitions for the purpose of this initial inquiry. A scientific definition might go something like this: the behavior exhibited by systems resulting from interconnectivity within systems, interconnectivity between systems, and interconnectivity between systems and their environments, where a single change triggers multiple effects. A somewhat more accessible workplace definition might go something like this. When unpredictable events occur that are difficult to navigate due to the interconnection between many aspects of our organizations, such as the interconnection between people, culture, processes, technology, structures, governance, and the many other elements that we often deal with in our organizations. You'll see here from the scientific and also the workplace definition that interconnectivity seems to play a central role. When we talk about interconnectivity, we talk about what I mean by interconnectivity is how one thing is connected to another thing, how one part of the system communicates with another part of the system, or how one part of a system impacts other elements of a system. And this might get us a little bit closer to framing what we did in this inquiry. I want to provide you with a quick summary of our approach without getting too bogged down on methodology. There were three main lines of inquiry. The first, we inquired into the types of complexity that leaders in Tasmania experience. Second, we inquired into how leaders in Tasmania make sense of the complexity they experience. And the third line of inquiry investigated the skills that leaders perceived when required to navigate the complexity in the state. We used a mixed method approach that included a complexity leadership lab with 17 leaders. These 17 leaders were all graduates from Tasmanian leaders programs. And we also conducted a complexity leadership skills survey with 39 respondents, and 41% of these respondents were graduates from Tasmanian leaders programs. Based on this methodology, there were some key limitations. Firstly, it was a self-selected sample. So these were leaders who were motivated to participate in an inquiry on complexity. Second, they were quite small samples, which means that we can't necessarily generalize to all leaders across Tasmania. And that's one of the reasons that we framed this as an initial inquiry into complexity in Tasmania. We only focused on complex issues. As a result, we didn't inquire into the simpler and more mundane challenges that leaders face on a daily basis. And finally, we've deliberately focused on more subjective perceptions to get an understanding as to how leaders experience complexity in their daily work lives. So a few slides ago, we looked at the complexity gap findings, but why does leading in complexity really matter to leaders in Tasmania? Well, in the context of the survey, we asked respondents to rate their agreement with two prompts. The first prompt was, complexity in Tasmania has increased significantly over the past 5 years. The second prompt was, to what extent are you currently experiencing complexity as a leader in Tasmania? And again, the caveat here is they were working with relatively small samples. But when we take a look at the findings here, in response to the first prompt, complexity in Tasmania has increased significantly over the past 5 years, we found that only 2.6% of respondents disagreed, 30.8% of respondents neither agreed nor disagreed, 46.2% of respondents agreed, and 20.5% of respondents strongly agreed. In response to the second prompt, to what extent are you currently experiencing complexity as a leader in Tasmania, 2.6% of respondents said to a very low extent, 10.3% of respondents said to a low extent, 30.8% of respondents said to a moderate extent, 38.4% of respondents said to a high extent, and 17.9% of respondents said to a very high extent. So even though we're working with small samples, there may be reasons to believe that complexity is becoming more salient and perhaps becoming more of a daily experience for at least some leaders in Tasmania. And these quantitative findings were consistent with the qualitative comments that we heard. For example, one survey respondent indicated that we've been let down by our leaders. The future is not just complex, it's scary. Too many vested interests, too much inflexibility, a changing world. In my view, the quotes from the survey started to bring some of our findings to life. So as I mentioned, there were three main lines of inquiry we were tackling. And the first line of inquiry focused on the types of complexity experienced by leaders in Tasmania. The first type of complexity we tackled was intrapersonal complexity, which is the kind of complexity leaders experience within themselves. In terms of intrapersonal complexity, leaders shared considerations such as feeling like imposters in their leadership roles, experiencing cognitive dissonance, and experiencing tension between prioritizing their own personal health and meeting demanding professional obligations. Intrapersonal complexity focuses on the kind of complexity that leaders experience in their relationships. In terms of intrapersonal complexity, In terms of intrapersonal complexity, leaders shared considerations such as the need to navigate tension between candor and compassion with stakeholders, navigating political biases, navigating potential power structures, and also experiencing some resistance to innovation. Systemic complexity. In terms of systemic complexity, we explored complexity in a variety of different systems: technological, organizational, political, social and cultural, and environmental systems. Let's go through them each in turn. In terms of technological complexity, leaders commented on the rapid technological change they were experiencing, cybersecurity demands, and the need to integrate new systems into existing and sometimes dated infrastructure. In terms of organizational complexity, leaders commented on the disruption to team culture as a result of virtual work arrangements, striving to be collaborative while ensuring efficient and sometimes fast-paced decision-making. In terms of political complexity, leaders commented on the need to navigate tensions between state interventions and individual freedoms, and the tensions between the need for longer-term planning versus the need to hit shorter-term goals. In terms of social and cultural complexity, leaders commented on entrenched social divisions they often experienced in Tasmania, economic disparity, and also some resistance to change. And finally, in terms of environmental complexity, leaders commented on the need to navigate competing values between economic considerations and social pressure, and polarized views on topics such as climate change. Finally, we come to foundational complexity, which includes epistemic complexity and ethical complexity. By epistemic complexity, what we meant was the kind of complexity that leaders experience when they're trying to work out what's true, what can they believe, what information sources can they rely on. In terms of epistemic complexity, leaders shared considerations such as the limited media diversity and investigative journalism in Tasmania, and also the need for evidence-based decision-making while also balancing intuition and personal experience. By ethical complexity, we meant the kind of complexity leaders experience when working out what an ethical course of action would look like, what's good and what's just. In terms of ethical complexity, leaders shared considerations such as the dilemmas related to data sharing and transparency, and the lack of an ethical framework shared by leaders and politicians to inform decision-making. So at this point in the inquiry, I felt a need for a metaphor, and this is what I came up with. These dynamics collectively evoke the metaphor of a socio-political terrarium, a self-contained system that is both fragile and complex, requiring careful stewardship to balance preservation and progress. So let me share a little as to why I thought this metaphor might be meaningful. I thought of a terrarium because this is a state that is somewhat self-contained, perhaps a little isolated, that has limited interactions with systems such as the Australian mainland. I thought of fragility and complexity because of the interconnectedness across the state suggests that even small changes can have reverberations across other parts of the system. I thought of preservation because Tasmania seems to be a relatively close-knit state that wants to maintain harmony with stakeholders and protect the state's unique cultural assets. I thought of progress because the state is striving for transformational change to address entrenched systemic issues across the state. But how do leaders in Tasmania actually make sense of these complexities? Well, this was the second part of the inquiry. During the Complexity Leadership Lab, leaders were invited to make sense of complexity by engaging with a series of reflection exercises. They included the following two questions. How often do you need to directly address complex challenges within this domain? And from a leadership perspective, how difficult is it to navigate these challenges? Based on the insights from the lab, there seems to be some preliminary evidence to suggest that interpersonal, technological, organizational, political, social and cultural, epistemic, and ethical complexities are experienced most frequently and are also experienced as most difficult. But so what? So what does this actually mean in terms of developing leadership in Tasmania? Well, it may start to point towards some of the skills that need to be cultivated so leaders can be more effective at navigating these particular types of complexities. For example, maybe there are particular relational skills required to navigate interpersonal complexities. Maybe there are particular systems practices that are required to navigate technological, organizational, and political complexities. Or perhaps there are particular cognitive and evaluative skills that are required to navigate epistemic and ethical complexities. So in addition, we also asked our lab participants to reflect on potential root causes of the complexities they were experiencing. And three main root causes emerged. They were competing goals, a lack of clear boundaries, and interconnectedness within and between systems. Let's talk them through in turn. So in terms of addressing competing goals, leaders commented on competing priorities between economic, community, and environmental systems. They commented on tensions between the need to meet short-term financial interests and longer-term community goals. And in the context of not-for-profit organizations, we heard that there's often tension between their dependence on government funding and also wanting to challenge the status quo. In terms of a lack of clear boundaries, leaders commented on roles and responsibilities and the need to work out who's accountable for what, identifying where one issue ends and another one begins. There was also a clear emphasis on the existence of silos across the state that often restrict collaboration and information sharing. And finally, in terms of interconnectedness, leaders commented that a change in one part of Tasmania can ripple across the entire state. There are different stakeholders vying for diverse goals and sometimes competing for limited resources. So what do we do about all of this? How might we equip leaders in Tasmania to navigate complexity more skillfully? Well, one survey respondent suggested that the leadership we need will not happen by chance. There needs to be ever stronger, purposeful support and development. Let's take a closer look. We started to address the challenge of developing leaders in Tasmania by drafting a complexity leadership skills framework based on a variety of sources. These sources include the reflections that were shared during the Complexity Leadership Lab and also a number of future-oriented skills frameworks. Our Complexity Leadership Skills Framework comprised three types of skills: foundational skills, relational skills, and systemic skills. The foundational skills include self-awareness and self-leadership, perseverance and purpose, curiosity and lifelong learning, decision-making and judgment, empathy and perspective taking, emotional regulation and management of group dynamics, and adaptability and flexibility. The relational skills included effective communication, creating collaborative spaces, people and team leadership, and finally, boundary spanning and relationship building. The systemic skills include digital and technological competency, strategic thinking and foresight, and finally, systems thinking and practice. After defining this complexity leadership skills framework, we conducted a survey on these skills. So the first question we asked respondents was, what level of capability do you believe will be required for leaders in Tasmania to lead effectively in 2024 and beyond? All 14 skills in the Complexity Skills Framework were rated between high and very high, and there was no statistically significant differences between the ratings for these skills. The second question we asked respondents was, how would you rate your own current level of capability? All 14 skills were rated between moderate and high. And digital and technological competency was rated lower than some other skills. The third question we asked respondents was, how would you rate the typical level of capability among the leaders with which you work regularly? In this case, all 14 skills were rated between low and moderate, and there were no statistically significant differences between ratings of skills. So what does this actually tell us? Well, perhaps what it suggests is that there's a recognition that all skills seem to be important aspects for navigating complexity, but potentially there are significant opportunities to develop many, if not all of these skills, particularly including digital and technological competency, developing these skills in oneself and also in other leaders across the state. So as a result of this inquiry, we've generated 5 main recommendations to take this work forward. Recommendation 1, focus on complexity leadership skills in management Focus on complexity leadership skills in management and leadership education and development. Often leader and leadership development programs focus on things like building coaching skills and influencing skills and fostering more constructive behavioral styles. And we think there's an opportunity to focus more explicitly on some of the complexity leadership skills introduced in the white paper. Recommendation 2, shift emphasis from leader development to leadership development. In the leadership literature, we often distinguish between leader development that focuses on developing individual leaders, mindsets, behaviors, skills, attributes, and whatnot, and leadership development, which focuses on developing leadership in collectives, such as relationships and ways of working. And whereas leader development is a little more like focusing on human capital, leadership development is a little more like focusing on social capital. Often development programs focus on developing individual leaders, but the complexity that some leaders are confronted with may exceed the ability of any one leader. And for that reason, there may be good reasons, and for that reason,
It's
and for
okay.
that reason,
It's okay.
sorry.
Start that bit again about shifting the emphasis. I think that's a good place to start. Yeah, start that thought.
Okay,
Okay.
cool. Let me go back. Cool. Recommendation 2, shift the emphasis from leader development to leadership development. Leader development focuses on developing individual leaders, such as mindsets, behaviors, skills, and individual attributes. Leadership development focuses on developing leadership in collectives, such as relationships, ways of working, and cultural attributes. So, whereas leader development is a little more like focusing on human capital, leadership development is a little more like focusing on social capital. Often development programs focus on developing individual leaders, but the complexity that some leaders are confronted with may exceed the ability of any one leader. So there may be good reasons to shift our emphasis from leader to leadership development. Recommendation 3, invest in digital and technological competency development. Some preliminary evidence from our white paper suggests that leaders rated their current level of capability in digital and technological competency significantly lower than the other complexity leadership skills. But digital and technological competency may play a critical role in navigating complexity because of its information processing horsepower. This may include the use of big data, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies. Recommendation 4, embed systems thinking and practices into organizational processes. Systems thinking and practice may play a role in helping leaders to skillfully work with complexity. And this is because these practices that can help leaders to skillfully work with interconnectivity. Systems thinking and systems practices could be introduced into processes such as sense making and leadership decision making. Recommendation 5, established shared visioning and conflict resolution frameworks. Competing goals was perceived to be one of the key drivers of complexity in Tasmania. So shared visioning approaches may support leaders to achieve stronger alignment between stakeholders by working with diverse perspectives, being able to hold polarities, and establish shared goals for the future. At some point in the future, we hope you might be able to discuss these findings and do some sense making with a friend or a colleague. And 2 questions that come up for us include the following. First, what resonates with your personal experience of leading in Tasmania? And what additional opportunities or solutions do you see for strengthening leadership in Tasmania? If you haven't already obtained a copy of the white paper, you can download a copy via the QR code on this slide. Last, but certainly not least, we want to acknowledge and thank the organisations that have partnered with Tasmanian leaders to make this initial inquiry possible. I want to thank all of you for being part of this initial inquiry into leadership and complexity in Tasmania. We hope you might engage with this work more deeply, and I look forward to connecting with you sometime in the near future. Bye for now.